good evening from Stockholm. My name is Nicholas Alod. I am head of the Europe program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And I'm going to be introducing and moderating this evening's webinar on the prospects for European security. I'm going to start by explaining a little about the title to this webinar, which is Must Europe Defend Itself? Because a little bit of thought into this title. It implies two distinct questions, I think. One, and the two questions are distinguished by the emphasis that you put on certain words. The first of those questions is whether Europe must defend itself, with the emphasis on defend. In other words, whether there is a real risk of conflict spreading out of the current battleground in Ukraine into the rest of the continent. We all know that this war has been proceeding for over 2 years now, since Russia launched its major invasion in 2022. And just recently, we've been hearing comments on the situation, which must be orchestrated in some way by European politicians and soldiers. I take the Swedish example at an annual conference on defense matters, which takes place in January every year. We heard this year the Minister of Civil Defense talking about the real possibility of war in Sweden. And he was quickly followed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Swedish military, who made much the same sort of comment. Just a few days later, the head of the British Army said that Britain would need to train what he called a citizen army to be prepared to fight on land in the future. And other figures across Europe, as I say, both politicians and soldiers, have been making rather similar comments in the last few weeks, from people in Denmark and Germany and Estonia and Poland and other places. So the first of those questions can be recapitulated as follows. How dangerous is our situation? Must Europe, outside of Ukraine, defend itself? The second interpretation of the title of this webinar puts the emphasis on a slightly different word, and that is a question of whether Europe must defend itself. That is, whether Europe must expect in the future, maybe the near future or the longer term, to defend itself alone, without the sort of help from across the Atlantic that most European countries that belong to NATO had come to expect. A few weeks ago, a former American president and a current presidential candidate, he made rather inflammatory remarks about his willingness to take America, if he were to become president again, into the defense of some current member states of the alliance, if, in his view or America's view, they had not sufficiently contributed to their defense budgets, and thus excessively free-ridden on the security shield that America provides. Now, I think some of the reporting of these comments was a little bit exaggerated. He didn't quite say what some reports suggested that he did say. But it's also fair to say that these comments did not come entirely out of the blue. In fact, you could say that they represent an extremely blunt expression of the sort of thoughts that many people in America across the political spectrum have been having for some time. And that fact has got some Europeans thinking too. So if the European branch of NATO, which of course now, since a few days ago, includes Sweden, encounters anything like the mortal danger that Ukraine has encountered, could it really count on America, the alliance's most powerful member, to defend it any more fully than it has defended Ukraine? That is, with more than just weapons and money. Okay, now that I've explained the title of the seminar we have a lot to discuss. We have to discuss Europe's current position in relation to potential spreading of the conflict in Ukraine. We have to discuss American politics, both in the short term, in the run-up to the election in November, and in relation to the country's grand strategy more broadly. But we also have to discuss Europe and how Europe, in its various institutional constellations, should adapt to the changing situation. And luckily, I have three outstanding contributors to help us in this discussion. We have first Michael Nyberg, who is Professor of History and Chair of War Studies at the US Army War College in Pennsylvania. We have also Daniel Krebs, an Associate Professor of History who works in the Department of National Security and Strategy, also at the US Army War College in Pennsylvania. And we have Ulla Lovchalic, I should get that right, who is an analyst who works with me in the Europe program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs here in Stockholm. Before we get going properly on our discussion, I must explain two more things. The first is how this webinar will work. We will hear some reasonably short presentations from my colleagues here, and I will try to be a firm moderator in this discussion in relation to time. Then I will allow the three of you to put questions to each other if you have any questions or follow-up comments that you want to make in relation to what you've heard. And then for the last 20 minutes or so, I would like to invite questions from people taking part elsewhere, so the audience in this webinar. And how do you put questions? It's simple. You write them in the chat and send them to us. I can't guarantee that every question will be put to our panelists, but I'm hoping that a good selection will be possible to raise with them. The final thing I should say is that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available subsequently on the Institute's website. With that all said, I think we should proceed. And I will turn first and foremost to Michael. Please take it away.
Hello, everybody from London. Before I get started, I have to say that anything that Dan and I express today in these webinars are our personal opinions. They do not reflect the policy of the United States government, the United States Army, or any agency therein. So we've got the disclaimer out of the way. I think the first thing I want to start with is by noting that the words of the former president did not come out of nowhere historically. In fact, what the United States has done since 1945 is unusual in its history, and I would argue it's unusual in the history of any great power. This debate began for Americans in 1919 with the question of what America's obligation to Europe was and what grand strategy would allow the United States to pursue its interests without being dragged into another war in Europe. Broadly speaking, those two grand strategies were unilateralism, sometimes known as isolationism, and multilateralism. And there was a strong criticism of multilateralism inside the United States, the fear that it would entangle the United States in security problems not of its making or not of its core interest, a loss of autonomy, and a compromise of national sovereignty. And those ideas have not gone away in the United States ever. They were very powerful in the America First movement of the 1930s. And they were kind of in abeyance during the Cold War period. But the Cold War is, of course, over, and with it has gone the American consensus on multilateralism. And I think we're now entering the beginning of whatever the post-Cold War phase is going to look like in Europe. And it's not clear what the United States' role will be in this new phase. Moreover, today's geopolitical context is very different from that of the Cold War. I think I'm right in guessing that Joe Biden will be the last American politician with the Cold War baked into his intellectual DNA. Just to give you an example, Ron DeSantis, one of Donald Trump's challengers for the Republican nomination, was 11 years old when the Berlin Wall came down. And I think it's safe to say that the next generation of American political leaders will be shaped much more by September 11th and much more by the rise of China than they will intellectually by the Cold War. Ukraine, moreover, has very strange associations in this campaign season for the presidency for the supporters and for the distractors of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. that are likely to make European security something more than just a strategic issue as we approach the election this fall. Ukraine was, of course, the cause of one of Donald Trump's impeachments. It was also part of the allegations against Joe Biden's son, who was alleged to have acted improperly when he was on the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian corporation. On Ukraine, there is now a hard right in the United States that wants to remove or reduce U.S. support. This issue is creating some very strange, irrational, emotional cleavages in the American political system, of course, made much worse because we are in the middle of a presidential election cycle. Internationally, of course, the United States finds itself in a position of multipolarity. The official position of the United States government has been for some time now to think about what is sometimes called the pivot or shift to Asia, to focus a little more on Asian security and the rise of what the Americans call their pacing threat, which is the growth of China in the Pacific. Moreover, as recent events have clearly demonstrated, it is going to be difficult, if not impossible, for the United States to ignore the Middle East in the ways that it at least hoped, I think, it might have been able to do a couple of years ago. The fundamental security problems the United States faced a couple of years ago have not gone away. The world has only become more dangerous, more multipolar, and seemingly more unstable. This leads not unnaturally, I think, to many American strategists and many American citizens asking why Europe can't shoulder more of the burden for European defense on its own. Why does 80% of NATO spending come from non-EU states, predominantly, of course, the United States and Britain? And why, according to some Americans anyway, is the United States spending more on Europe's defense than Europe is spending on Europe's defense? There is also an attitude in the United States. I'm not suggesting that I share any of these attitudes, but there is an attitude in the United States as well that the U.S. was right in its warnings on Germany's connection to the Nord Stream energy pipeline through Russia and the strategic exposure that that provided, that the United States was right to warn Europe that it had to be at the 2% benchmark for NATO spending, imprecise though that proxy may be, and that, of course, the United States was right in its estimates of Russia's intentions towards Ukraine. In other words, the question that some Americans are asking, why can't Europe see what the United States has been seeing when it comes to European security? And most fundamentally, if Europe can't make the defense of Europe a priority, why should the United States make the defense of Europe a priority? Now, Americans may recognize that some parts of Europe are, in fact, making the defense of Europe a priority, and that 2% may, in fact, be the wrong way to measure Europe's commitment to its own defense. Still, I think it's important to note that Americans are asking the questions and they're not always getting satisfactory answers. Even myself, a committed transatlanticist, find these questions sometimes hard to answer when I'm talking to Americans who don't share my core belief in the transatlantic alliance. Moreover, I think we can draw two other historical parallels, one from 1914 to 1917 and the other from 1939 to 1941, when there is a war going on in Europe. The American people know which side they favor. They know which side they want to support, but they equally know that they don't want to take any action that will drag them into a shooting war itself in Europe. So in some ways, we are in familiar territory, even if it is uncomfortable intellectual territory. Now, in the second half of this, I want to talk a little bit about the choices looking ahead for the United States, none of which look particularly good as the United States enters into this very divisive, very difficult election season that is just beginning, this endless, very long election season that we are now just starting. Politically, the United States finds itself quite badly divided and finds itself the government finds itself almost impossible to do some of the necessary basic things of governance, like pass a budget. As Dan and I have both been living this the last couple of months, we are working on a series of continuing resolutions, the next one of which I believe expires in about 2 weeks. If you can't get the small things right, though passing a budget may not seem like a small thing, in theory at least, it ought to be something that the government can do. Imagine the difficulty of doing the complex things like setting and sticking to a national grand strategy that would deal with and prioritize the nation's resources and its challenges. The United States, some have argued, is already at strategic overstretch. It is clearly already deeply in debt, with other calls on national resources besides defense. Moreover, I think, unlike in the Cold War period, there is no consensus in the United States about where American priorities ought to be and what risks the United States might appropriately take when it does finally develop a grand strategy or when it executes a strategy almost by improvisation. The pivot to Asia still has as much of a consensus as anything else in the American political sphere. The worries about the rise of China, the worries about Asian security seem to be one thing that at least Republicans and Democrats can agree upon, even if they may not agree upon exactly how to deal with that problem. But, and I cannot stress this enough, my belief that the Middle East is not leaving the United States alone. It is, in fact, becoming a larger security problem for the United States rather than a smaller one. Both the Israeli war in Gaza, the connection that Iran has to many of the problems that the United States is dealing with, from Gaza all the way down to the Red Sea and the Houthi crisis. The Middle East is simply not going away in the way that many American strategists had hoped that it might. Now, if I'm right, what's happening inside the United States is, as Nicholas alluded, as much about domestic political support as it is anything else. It's as much about each side trying to fire up its base as we approach this election season. And if I'm right, the more that Europe shows to the American people, not just its leadership, that it is serious about its defense, the more criticism from the United States will begin to decline. And certainly Sweden coming into NATO is a beautiful example of just how seriously Sweden is taking its defense. A Newsweek poll taken after Donald Trump made his comments showed that 64% of Americans supported the United States being a member of NATO. Only 7% of Americans voted that they were opposed to NATO. Now, there is some partisan separation in this data. 50% of Republicans expressed a desire for their country, for the United States, to remain in NATO. That figure was 75% among Democrats. But the point is, it's still quite popular, and especially in an election season, the American politicians will have to follow, at least somewhat, the will of the voters. Support for NATO actually went up after Trump made his comments, and opposition to American participation in NATO actually went down. So those are good trends, and they are trends that are consistent with historical polling trends on the American people's view on NATO. One other survey showed that 61%, even of Republicans, that is the group that's more opposed to American membership of NATO, 61% of Republicans said that the United States should defend Europe if Russia attacked a NATO member state. So the commitment of the American people has not gone away. This is also, I should note, the issue where the Republican Party in the House and in the Senate have pushed back against Donald Trump, the undisputed leader of the Republican Party, most frequently and most often, protecting America's commitment to NATO and making sure that very little is done in the Congress that would put that in jeopardy. The bottom line, because I want to yield time to my colleagues here, from the American perspective, I think it's safe to say, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, his ramping up of defense spending to 7% of Russian GDP, his words and his actions should be a watershed moment for European security. They are actions that should drive Europe not just to talk about its defense, not just to think about its defense, but to begin to take action. It's enough, of course, as we all know sitting on this call, to bring two traditional neutral states, Sweden and Finland, into NATO. That is a watershed moment. It is my view, again, my view, not the Army War College's view, that with these actions should also come a watershed change in defense spending. Even though it's going up throughout much of Europe, the 2% metric may not nearly be enough anymore to deal with the threat from Russia, which seems only to grow. It may, in fact, require Europe to go back to something that looks more like Cold War-era defense spending levels and Cold War-era commitment to security of Europe on levels both military and non-military. I believe I'm right in saying that to achieve credible deterrence against the Russians will require that kind of effort, from NATO's European partners. The mere existence of Article 5 and the mere existence of NATO, with or without the United States, by itself is insufficient to provide that deterrence, which must be clear and it must be capable. Europe is in brand new territory here. I think the United States is watching carefully to see what Europe does beyond its words, but to see its actions. And I think I'm safe in saying, in concluding with this, that NATO remains popular in the United States, its European partners remain popular, and America's commitment to the defense of Europe remains popular. But that the American people want to see NATO and Europe as a partner and not as a free rider on American security guarantees. With that, I'll say tack så mycket, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Particularly good Swedish pronunciation at the end there. I thought your contribution would have been very sobering in places for a European audience, but also quite encouraging in other respects. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the current and historical points that you raised. But let us proceed now to our second speaker. Daniel, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thanks again, excuse me, Nick, for organizing this. And yeah, a lot of what I'm going to say is complements a little bit what Mike is saying. I mean, you invited two historians to think about these questions, and so no surprise that we're both thinking a little bit, from a historical perspective here. So my main points that I wanted to get across is I do think that Europe needs to plan for a reduced military and strategic focus of the United States on Europe. I don't think that the United States will leave NATO in the next 4 or 5 years, but there will be questions about collective defense, especially under a possible second Trump presidency. Effective deterrence, as my political science colleagues know much better, vis-a-vis Russia is already undermined due to these recent comments. And that goes a little bit to your second point and second question that you had about can Europe then defend itself? There are questions about capabilities in Europe. There are questions about readiness in Europe in terms of their military and their ability to actually, in case, do take up the defense. Of course, the other part we can't really know, and that is the question of whether or not Russia will be willing in the future to attack another European country besides Ukraine. So those questions we can of course discuss then later on in today's webinar. One note on that I wanted to highlight is that at the recent Munich Security Conference, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance announced very clearly that for him, Russia is not an existential threat to Europe. He is a Republican senator, and that shows, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, where at least part of the American political establishment, what they're thinking is. There is currently only one bipartisan consensus, and Mike said that already, in the United States, and that is that Europe needs to do more for its own defense, and that the U.S. foreign and strategic defense policy focus should be on Asia in competition with China, not Europe. What I see is also that the current presidential campaign makes it really unlikely that the United States will pass another large military aid package for Ukraine. After November, after the election, it seems even more difficult to pass such a package. The reason is simply that President Biden might be reelected, but there is a good chance that the U.S. Senate will go into Republican hands, and then we have divided government again, even if the Democrats regain the House. So there's a little bit of a less optimistic picture here coming from my perspective. When I'm looking then, and this is the historian in me, at the history of alliances for the United States, to go on that part of the question that you posed to us, the United States in its history has maintained relatively few long-term alliances. That goes back all the way to the Revolution, of course, and the comments made by Alexander Hamilton in the famous farewell address for George Washington, where he warned of these engagement and entanglements in long-term alliances. All through the 19th century, the United States focused on the Americas, on its own continent, of course, the conquest against natives, the conquest of land from Mexico, and then, of course, the Civil War. Only by the end of the 19th century did the United States venture out of its sphere, if you will, with Hawaii, and then, of course, the Spanish American War and the addition of the Philippines, for example, as colonies to the United States. Main alliances for the United States were usually with European powers, but it took World War I and World War II for the United States to join a long-standing permanent alliance. That in other words, this long-term commitment to NATO for us now a fact and seemingly forever situation is in the history of the United States a fairly short and recent development that begins only after World War II. Um, until World War II, in fact, it was the general sentiment. There was skepticism, even against having permanent armies. When you look at the U.S. military history, you see that it is an ebb and flow or a cycle of ramping up military spending and increasing a military buildup for a particular conflict, and then immediately demobilizing after that conflict. So that maintaining a high readiness, a lot of forces, and maintaining these kinds of long-term alliances, military alliances, is a fairly recent development in U.S. History. What we in fact see is a series of periods of isolationism, a period in which we seem to be in right now. When we look at the era post-American Revolution, or the post-War of 1812 era, or the post World War One, and even the immediate aftermath of World War II, certainly the post-Vietnam era. So we're all periods in which the United States went into a time of isolationism and thinking and focusing on the domestic era vis-a-vis other parts of the world. For example, after World War II, the Republican Party really for about a year and a half wanted to quickly demobilize, focus on U.S. domestic economy. All across the political spectrum, Americans believed that things would now be possibly governed by the United Nations. Only when all of this, and of course they believed in their nuclear monopoly. Only when all of these plans, so to speak, ideas fell through, did the U.S. Almost reluctantly then decide, okay, we do need to build up our military. We do need to maintain our engagement in Europe and with the world. So these things we have to keep in mind. When we then think about the post-World War II era, that era of the Cold War, we see that long-term commitment to containment. And here containment dominated the grand strategy, and it was, of course, aimed at the ideological, political, military adversary in a bipolar world that fits a little bit what Mike was saying about multilateralism. Um, this containment and this hefty investment in European security and engagement in Europe enjoyed broad bipartisan support for many years, even decades. It was paired with that military buildup. We all know that in Europe. But then the Cold War ended, and especially after 9/11, the United States engaged heavily in the Middle East. Around the globe, it was about terrorism and fighting terrorism, and then engaged in two wars in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, and those wars had consequences. And I think we were living in an era in which we see these consequences taking shape. Among the one half, if you will, of the political spectrum in the United States, the Republican Party, neoconservatives and traditional Republicans certainly have lost influence. On the Democratic side, the Democratic Party side, Iraq and that conflict there was loathed from the start. Afghanistan was considered the right war, but there were deep conflicts within the Democratic Party about what kind of strategy should be taken in Afghanistan. And the American people, looking at those conflicts, wars that seem to go on forever and ever and never ended, there's increasing skepticism about international engagement of the United States, especially international military engagement. When they then look toward Europe, what they saw in Europe, and these are some of the questions that Mike also mentioned, that the American people started asking are, there is a continent now that seems secure. There is no more Soviet threat. There is a continent that is rich. There's a continent where we have established rich democracies. And so increasingly questions came up about why is it that we are engaged to secure a continent that seemingly, depending on where you come from, can do it itself, or certainly has the resources to do that itself. but is unwilling for a lot of Americans to do anything or more than is absolutely necessary and part of basic agreements in the NATO alliance. Um, Questions about this kind of alliance then also came up during the Afghanistan conflict. Something that we often overlooked initially, that Afghanistan conflict is seen as a success story for NATO. But especially from the US side and from the US military side, what they see during that conflict is that there are NATO partners who are unable to even do that very limited engagement that was necessary in Afghanistan. And so questions about European readiness, capabilities, etc., came up among the military and, of course, also the political leadership. Just like Mike then said, then after the Cold War and in that period after 9/11 and with the end of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, the one issue globally that really caused then concern for the United States was not Europe, but that resurgent China. Whether it's called in one of the national security strategies a revisionist China, or now it's called the pacing challenge to the United States. But those are the kinds of things that right now really concern broadly across the political spectrum the United States. The last point that I wanted to make a little bit is about a focus on domestic politics today in the United States. Um, we see a deeply divided political environment. Mike has already talked about that a little bit. The Republican Party, for example, is seemingly completely divided among itself. And what we see here now is that the dominant factions in the Republican Party are all somewhat isolationist, whether it is Trump and the MAGA Republicans or the Tea Party Freedom Caucus Republicans. All of them, or even the libertarians, all of them have questions about international engagement for the United States. The traditional Republicans that looked toward the world and argued for a muscular foreign policy for the United States seem to have lost market influence in the Republican Party. And then, of course, there is President Trump, or former President Trump, now running for a second term in office. And he, of course, sees everything through a lens of himself, essentially. And so he's become, he shows certainly these autocratic tendencies, admires strongmen. And the problem with that, though, is that such leaders, political scientists have shown that much more so than historians in some ways, they frequently engage in risk-taking internationally. They also are susceptible to miscalculations, and so that is one of those fears, of course, that from a European perspective now, when folks look toward the United States and what's happening here domestically. Domestically, also politically, I would argue that post-COVID, the pandemic here had some effects, and of course Afghanistan, which I mentioned already. Inflation and other economic challenges here really lead the United States toward a focus more on itself rather than the world outside. I'll leave it at that, and then hopefully hit some of the other points that I wanted to say in the follow-up discussion. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Daniel. Thank you very much. Thank you for reminding us about containment during the Cold War, something that I can say I grew up with, but then didn't realize its significance at the time, of course. It now seems so much clearer in retrospect. You also talk about the other challenges that face the US around the globe, and about the relationship between American orientation in the world and its domestic politics. Which way does the causality run, to put a classic political scientist's question? Let's move to our third speaker before we come back to some of those questions, perhaps. Ulla, please, your turn.
Thank you, Nick. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation, and thank you also to Michael and Daniel for giving interesting remarks. And now I am going to talk more about the European perspective. And so the first question, Nick, that you asked is, must Europe defend itself? And I believe that Europe has many reasons to defend itself today. And the most obvious one is Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the threat from Russia is systemic, and it is something that we will probably have to deal with long-term in Europe. And then on top of that, we also have an increasing militarization in China that affects both Europe and the US. And the US has responded to this by pivoting to Asia, which is potentially leaving Europe behind, or some of the implications could be damaging to the relationship between US and Europe. And then also, lastly, we have the potential risk, you could say it, of Trump's comeback. Many are seeing it that way. We know how it went the first time around, and it doesn't seem to be easier with a second round of a Trump administration. And then to your second question, can Europe defend itself on its own? Well, it doesn't look that way, at least as it is now. Europe has for a very, very long time been heavily dependent on the US for its security umbrella. And I believe that that has also led to that we have a very fragmented defense spending in Europe. We have fragmented defense forces and also fragmented procurement systems, as well as low stockpiles, because we have heavily relied on the support from the US. And also, Europe has underinvested in its armed forces for the past 2 decades. So we are far behind in where we should be today, considering the threats we are facing. But Europe has done at the same time a lot of things in the last couple of years. So recognizing these vulnerabilities and these new threats, we have seen a lot of new initiatives in Europe. It's a complete alphabet soup. We have the European Defence Fund. We have the coordinated annual review card. We have permanent structured cooperation. We have the European Peace Facility, which has been instrumental for the support to Ukraine, a strategic compass, and we have several initiatives on joint procurement in the EU. And also we have tried to ramp up the production of ammunition through the ASAP initiative. And also most recently, the Commission presented the European Defence Industry Strategy, which is trying to coordinate all these initiatives more and also improve the relationship between the EU and NATO. And then there's also a couple of things that have happened on the member state level. Most importantly, the huge Zeitenwende in Germany, Sweden and Finland, previously military non-aligned, have joined NATO. And we have several member state countries that have increased defense spending. I think it was in 2014, it was only 3 allies that met the target. And now in 2024, we're speaking of 18 allies that will meet the 2% spending target. But there are some challenges yet. This has been great, but it's not enough. And the scale of the challenge that we are facing now is beyond the capability of any European country acting alone. And the EU has the framework to collaborate more on defense and security. It has a legal framework and the institutional basis for common defense. But the key member states, and I'm referring to mainly Germany and France, they need to bring themselves into acting together. So, needless to say, while Ukraine and the war in Ukraine has led to an increase in defense spending by the member states, coordination is lacking in Europe, for instance. We see that 78% of all defense material procurement since the war began is from non-European countries, where over 60% is from the US. And this leads to gaps. Europe lacks certain critical enabler capabilities, such as long-range air defense, command and control, suppression of enemy air defenses, and so on. And these are areas that Europe still does not invest in collectively, but where the US then comes in and fills the gaps. So that leaves Europe very vulnerable should the US disengage from Europe. So generally speaking, Europe needs to invest more in common weapon systems and ammunition, and it needs to procure them together to make the cost lower, but also the systems interoperable, because there are a lot of different weapon systems in Europe today. And there is a problem in that both Trump and Biden administrations have lobbied for US access to the European defense market and EU defense funding. And it's been hard for some of the defense initiatives to go through fully, because there have been certain EU countries that have been afraid of what it would mean in the collaboration with the US if they would exclude US in these initiatives, which then means that this has had a chilling effect on the attempts to improve European coordination. So instead of making the matters more complicated, the US could empower Europe to step up its own defense by encouraging this type of defense integration, even though it would result in US company, like short term at least, US defense companies losing some of the market share in Europe. It would likely benefit the alliance by strengthening Europe's defense production capacity and improving Europe's ability to operate together. And then the scenario of a US disengagement. Well, if that would happen, if the US would disengage its troops, or if it would disengage itself from NATO in some way, or lower its aid, which we already see is happening, that the aid to Ukraine is very hard to push through and in the Congress in the US, that would definitely undermine the deterrence and damage the transatlantic ties, perhaps even spread to other areas. For instance, Europe's willingness to align with the US on other issues like China and trade policy, which is becoming increasingly important for the US. But it would also, I believe, damage US credibility and image in the world if the close ties that Europe and the US have built for so many years would so easily be jeopardized. So during Trump's primary campaign for president, he has suggested that if he would be re-elected in November this year, he would negotiate with Putin to end the Ukraine war in 24 hours and demand that Europe reimburse the US for ammunition used in Ukraine, etc. And this is, of course, very concerning for Europe, these kind of statements. And although Europe's combined military and financial aid to Ukraine now exceeds that of the US support remains vital to Ukraine's war effort and to Europe's security. So we should take this seriously. Trump's isolationism, however, it will likely influence US policy regardless of who wins in November. We are already seeing it in the economic sphere, that both Republican and Democrat lawmakers have made it clear that they intend to prioritize the Indo-Pacific going forward. And this will, of course, have implications for Europe. So to end this shortly, my conclusion is that Europe might be on its own, or we might end up on our own. And that's why we need to get more serious on defense.
Ulla, thank you very much for that contribution. Again, very nicely timed, like our other two speakers. I think you offered again a very balanced picture of the reasons to be concerned and perhaps pessimistic about the prospects of stronger European security, but also optimistic. You mentioned the big change in German policy over the last couple of years. You mentioned generally rising expenditure on defense amongst European countries. I would just raise my hand and suggest that Brexit might have a slightly counterintuitive effect here. I wonder whether Brexit might just incline Britain to be less reluctant about more cooperation in Europe on defence matters than it would have been if it had remained as an EU member state. But maybe we can return to that very hypothetical question. All right, let me remind everybody in the audience after those excellent contributions that if you want to put a question to one of our contributors, you can easily do so by writing in the chat. These questions will be curated, and I will see a selection of them, a good selection of them. I can't promise that every question will be put to our speakers, but with luck, a good selection of them will be. So please write in the chat if you have a question. But before we go to these questions, I want to give our three speakers a chance to comment perhaps on something that they've heard from one or both of the other two speakers, to think of a question or a follow-up that they would like to put. So please, Michael, Daniel, and Ulla, do you have anything you'd like to comment?
I do have a question, I think probably for Ulla, if I may. I know one of the challenges in getting European defense spending to do the things you suggest it has to do, and I agree with you, is that there is an economic incentive, of course. Germany wants to sell German equipment. The French want to sell French equipment because the arms industry is Sweden, of course, with the Gripens and others. Is that something the European Union as a body can help to rationalize, or is this going to be a structural problem that you think Europe is going to deal with? That as much as country X may want to do something for the greater good of Europe, country X's politicians are fundamentally interested in the employment of country X's citizens. So how do you see that playing out in the next couple of years? Thanks.
I think you're very right there. I think it is there is some protectionist instincts in the European countries when it comes to their own domestic industry. And I think it also has to do that many industries in Europe are also closely tied to the state. And I think there is a way to go around this, and it would be through maybe jointly funding a development of new technology. And that's also what we're seeing already in Europe. And also I know there's a collaboration on producing the next generation jets. Sweden is not now part of that project. It was initially, but the UK is, and Italy, and I also think that Japan joined later. And I think we're going to see more of these projects where we will need to pool our resources better and leave the protectionist instincts behind in order to create good capability.
Indeed, I agree with Ulla myself there, and it's interesting to note that a debate blows up in Sweden every now and again about its enormous investment in its own fighter aircraft. It's only Sweden and France that produce their own military aircraft, and whether this is really a rational use of Swedish defense spending can be discussed, but it maintains that strategic capability. So there's an argument for that too.
Yeah, and
any other thoughts or comments? Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, and first I want to thank Ulla for raising one point. I think that we should think about and debate a little bit. One thing that from a U.S. perspective that is the case is that Europe, or I should rather say the European Union, which overlaps but is not the same as NATO. The European Union is often seen more of as a competitor these days. And that I have heard European voices who say in the United States that Europe should be seen as the partner and really not as a competitor to the U.S. But because of that intense focus on the economy, there is of course that thinking of Europe primarily, often not by everybody, as a competitor. The other point that I think Ulla raised that we have to keep in mind when we're asking the question of can Europe defend itself, I would argue, and I mean you might hear it from my accent, I was born and raised in Germany. There are some parts of Europe that certainly do not want to defend themselves. Germany, first and foremost, I would argue, among them. Germany, I would argue, um, wants to be weak and wants thus to bind the United States to Europe because of its weakness. This is a complex argument that I shortened to one or two sentences, but there's certainly an argument to be made that by Europe being weak, it kind of binds the United States to Europe. In the United States, of course, this kind of dynamic is now causing some serious blowback, and we see it in parts of the political spectrum there in the United States. But that certainly is part a little bit of the discussion. And then finally, and this is a question that I have for Ulla as well. You mentioned that there is a systemic threat to Europe by Russia, and that of course goes counter to some other folks that argue that, well, without Putin it might all be different. But you seem to argue that no, even without Putin, there is still a Russia that is bent on this expansionist view of their position in Europe. So I was hoping to get some comments from you on that.
Ulla.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, well, what I meant is that the threat from Russia is not only related to Ukraine, but it started earlier than that with Russia seeing its neighbors viewing its surrounding as interest spheres rather than sovereign countries. And that's why I think that kind of thinking makes Russia more of a systemic threat in the international order that we have built with our rules. So it will not end with peace in Ukraine, or if Ukraine wins the war, but it's very important also that Russia loses this for Russia not to be a systemic threat to Europe.
Can I follow up on that question and that answer a little bit? I think the prevailing view in Europe is very much as Ulla articulates it, that the nature of the threat to the rest of the continent from Russia is intrinsic to the Russian regime as it is at the moment. So Russia behaves in this aggressive manner because of the nature of its leadership, of the nature of its regime. There is, of course, another way of looking at it, and looking at it from maybe a more international relations perspective. And in the growth of NATO in the last few decades, and the way that other powers have related to Russia, which perhaps stimulated its behavior. And it's not just an internal matter, not just internal forces that explain Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its previous behavior. What do you think is the thinking, Michael and Daniel, in American policymaking circles now? How is the nature of the Russian threat understood?
It is a typical, I don't know if it's typically American, but Americans like to personify their enemies. So Kaiser Wilhelm, we like to think if you can just get rid of the person, put in democracy and capitalism, this is straight Woodrow Wilson, this is straight 14 points, then the problems sort of fix themselves. That is baked into an American strategic outlook. I think many Americans are coming to the realization that democracy and capitalism are not coming to Russia anytime soon. At least they're not coming in a way that we would recognize. And that they have not, either in Russia or China, in neither of those cases, has globalization and an opening to the West changed those countries in the direction we expected to see change. I think there is much more of an awareness waking in the United States that, as I think Ulla's word is right, that the threat is systemic. And I think that there is much more of a realization that maybe this is my bias as an historian, that history is not developing in all parts of the world at the same speed, at the very least. I would argue they're not developing in the same nature in all parts of the world. It's not a question of Russia and China catching up to us a little more slowly. It is a question of their histories, their geographies, their collective mentalities, pulling them into a different direction than we thought they were going. And I think Putin's reaction to NATO is classic, whether he's being cynical or whether he's being genuine. whichever way he is, he must know that NATO circa 2 years ago was no threat to Russia in any way, shape, or form. It's built for deterrence. It's built for defense. It's not built for offensive warfare. That's not what it does. I tend to think it's him being cynical and looking for justifications for what he wants to do anyway. But I think there is coming a reality in the United States, which some exceptions, one that Dan mentioned, of a realization that Russia is just a very different place from the one that many Americans hoped it would become when the Cold War ended and Mikhail Gorbachev was doing ads for Pizza Hut on American TV. It has taken a sharp turn in a very different direction, and we need to take account of that, and we need to figure out whether that means we go back to a Cold War-like model or whether we have to rethink what grand strategy, what containment, what deterrence means in a 21st century interconnected world. I tend to think that it's the latter, and I tend to think that with so much about disruptive technology, we don't have the answers yet.
Yeah, I would add to that just briefly, to your question, Nick. It depends on where you look and whom do you speak to on the political spectrum and within the factions of various parties in the United States at this point. Like I mentioned, this broad containment consensus, even the relative consensus about the post 9/11 defense of American values vis-a-vis terrorist threats, that all has frayed, and especially it has frayed within the Republican Party. I would argue it really depends on whom do you talk to. There are factions in the American political system that will argue that you can appease, and I'm not using the term in terms of Munich, but that you can bring peace to Europe by just giving Russia parts of Ukraine and just satisfying their territorial claims. And then there's others in the United States, just like in Europe, that argue similar to what Ulla said, is that no, this will not satisfy Russia. This will only increase the danger to Moldova and other parts of the Baltics of further aggression by Russia. And when you talk to some of our Polish friends, they're really sincere about that, and at least in my own personal opinion, rightfully so. So in the U.S., there's no more. I would argue you can't say the Americans or the American people. It depends really whom you're talking to, and what particular stance they have in terms of finding answers to that. And there's a great variety now.
Thank you, Daniel and Michael, for those elaborations of our earlier discussion. We have a firm, concrete question that we have received from the audience, and I can put it to all three of you. The question is simply this: would the election of Donald Trump for a second term in the presidency in November, would that lead to a significantly reduced degree of American spending on defense in the coming years? What do you make of that scenario? Let me begin with you, Ulla. Do you have a thought on that?
I don't think it would reduce the spending per se, but I think it would change what the US is spending on. Because a fraction of that, I think it is maybe 1 to 2% is going to, you should correct me if I'm wrong, but to supporting Ukraine and also to the US engagement in Europe. So out of the US defense budget. And I think that maybe that would change, and that we have to remember that we have seen Trump's politics, and it's usually transactionalist, and I think we can expect more of that. So maybe instead of spending less on defense, we would see spending maybe on countries that meets the criteria or that align to Trump's position in some way, and I think that is rather the effect we would see.
Okay, Daniel, Michael.
Yeah, if I here I First of all, I do not think that there will be any reduced spending on the military in the United States. If there is one constant over the last few years, regardless of the administration, whichever party had the presidency or Congress or the Senate, usually military spending goes up. So I don't think that there's any chance of a reduced military spending if somebody is aiming for that. What I think is that the direction, the strategic and security policy focus of the United States will shift even further toward Asia under a presidency, Trump, a second Trump presidency. That shift is already underway, and it will only increase. The sense that Europe should take care of itself in very simplistic terms, that would, I think, increase. And the demands of Europe to actually support the United States in its focus on Asia, they would also increase. So I think it is something that that is underway, and that will only speed up a process that is currently underway in terms of shifting the U.S. focus to Asia and demanding, and under President Trump, it would not be an invitation, but be demanding a heavier European engagement also in Asia, and certainly a heavier European investment in its own security.
Yeah, I certainly agree in broad terms with what my two colleagues have said. Two quick points I would add. The first is the incredible importance of military bases to jobs and to the economy of local areas. And remember, it is the House of Representatives in the United States that set spending. It's not the White House. The White House has to agree to the budget, but the importance of military spending to congressional districts all over the country is going to be one factor that's going to work against any major cut. The other thing is, I don't detect any appetite from the American people to reduce military budgets in a way that would affect their politicians. And the story I love to tell people, a friend of my father's, when I go to visit him, will berate me time and again about how the military's budget has to go up and we have to spend more and we have to spend more. And one time I told him if he could get within $10 billion of what the U.S. defense budget actually was, I would buy him dinner. And the point, of course, was, like most Americans, he had no idea what the U.S.'s defense budget is. I don't think I know what the defense budget is, and my salary comes from it. The point is, he wanted more without having the hard figure of what that number actually was and where that money was going. So I don't detect much sense from the American people that they want the amount of money to go down, or even that it's a question that they're really asking. I just don't think the political pressure is there, and I don't see a political incentive for Trump to cut it either.
Very interesting answers. I take two things from what all three of you have just said. One of them in relation to America, and in particular in relation to Donald Trump, is that in some ways, even his more outlandish promises and outlandish behavior is pushing at a door that's already open. The level of military spending we don't think is going to go down. The concentration of attention and resources on Asia rather than Europe is something that is already happening, and we think that Trump is simply going to continue that. So in some ways, maybe a second Trump presidency wouldn't be such a rupture as some people might think. It might just continue a longer term trend. The other thing, which I think is very interesting, which you've all alluded to, is the nature of defense spending in almost any country and the mixed motives that inform defense spending. We talked about the Swedish investment in its own fighter plane earlier. We talked about these army bases scattered around America and indeed around the world, which have political significance as well. We have a question, which I'm seeking to expertly, having made that introduction, about the prospects of future European integration of defense procurement, what you were talking a little bit about earlier, Ulla. Given all these mixed motives, and I'll start with you again, if I may, what do you think are the prospects of really serious progress along the lines that the European Commission outlined just a few days ago in integrating the defence industries and procurement policies of the European Union's member states?
Well, I think that we have already started doing that with the funds that the EU has put forward, and that we're investing more in research and creating these new capabilities. And we also see with the new EDIRPA and EDIP, which are European procurement initiatives, that the Commission, at least, is very keen to focus more on this. And even though the budgets for those initiatives are not very big yet, I think we're going in that direction, but it's going to take time. And it takes time from investing in a product. It can take a decade to procure from the moment that you decide what you want to produce. So Europe doesn't really have time. And I think we're talking about earliest in a decade or so that we will see these initiatives bear fruit. But I think it is a good beginning, but it will be very hard, a mental challenge for many European countries to kind of kill your darlings or to see the benefits of procuring together.
What do you two think, Michael and Daniel, about this question of closer European integration in defense procurement and armament?
Well, I was just in Paris a couple of days ago having a conversation with a senior defense official from a major European state, I'll just put it that way, who is quite pessimistic on this score because he believes that these questions will ultimately be decided on the basis of domestic politics. They won't be decided exclusively on the needs of security, that the economic pressures, political pressures, social pressures, cultural pressures are likely to lead Europe to choose non-optimal solutions to these problems. So he's less optimistic on these scores, and he's someone who's quite expert, which could be why he's pessimistic. I don't know. It could lead into a greater level of pessimism. But I do think, given the experiences we've seen in Europe on joint projects, given what we've seen in projects like this, I think the challenges are real. They look like they're things that one should be able to overcome, especially given the threat that is sitting out there. But I think these threats, when you get right down to it, are very difficult. And Dan knows Germany far better than the rest of us. Germany's government is sort of set up so that it cannot easily make these decisions. So I think that the barriers are going to be real, and I think they're going to be more difficult to overcome than the security situation would suggest.
Yeah, I second everything that Mike just said, and I would add to that also a little anecdote. We had a recent speaker here in Carlisle, and he made very clear that what is done at NATO is done based on decisions and convictions and ideas in the capitals around the world that are NATO members. So what is done at NATO is decided in Washington or Paris or Berlin or London or Warsaw, and so it is really the sovereign will of those capitals that matter. And similar to Michael, I'm not very optimistic that this kind of necessary integration is the will for that is there based on national interests in these various countries. And Ulla mentioned it, and I think Nick too. I mean, looking at fighters and airplanes in Europe, it's just one of those examples. Whether it's FCAS or Tempest or Gripen or whatever it is, it's a corporation there would in many ways make a lot of sense, but it is not happening. It is not happening with main battle tanks. It is not happening with ammunition in many ways. So I'm similarly not very optimistic. The only way out of that is if the challenge is so big, and you would think that Russia and its attack on Ukraine would be that kind of challenge. And here's where I'm becoming like a proponent and making an argument, is that the Europeans should actually respond to that challenge, because I think that threat is there. But unfortunately, I don't see that. Um, that is something that again is a problem of Europe, that makes then somebody like the United States so necessary, because the United States can bring those capabilities that no single European country is willing or able to bring to its defense.
Ulla.
Yeah, I agree, but I also have a twist to this, and it's certainly so that the fragmented industry makes U.S. more important, and to fill these gaps. But it's kind of also the other way around. That when, for instance, certain European countries procure Abrams from the US or F-16 planes. Usually those contracts, they're very long. We're not just speaking buying a weapon system and then you can change to a European one that's procured commonly, but it is a contract that lasts for decades, and that also the dependence on US and the security guarantee that the Europe is dependent on from the US also makes it more difficult to create a European capability. So it kind of goes both ways around.
Okay.
If I can add
Sure,
one more
please
thing.
go ahead. Go ahead.
There is a thing talked about in technology and artificial intelligence about exploration versus exploitation. In other words, do you put your resources into researching the next generation of technology X, or do you get what you know is going to work because you need it quickly? And a case study of this is Poland buying tanks from South Korea. So they didn't buy them from the US and they didn't buy them from Europe. That's not because they didn't want to buy from those two partners. It's because they needed exploitation more than they needed exploration. They needed tanks that they knew they were going to get off the shelf into Poland as quickly as they possibly could. So there is that time dilemma too. The person I referred to is in a country that believes it has time to think about exploration more than exploitation. That is, they think they have time to get next generation weapons out and to take a couple of years to do that so that the quality of the weapons they will produce will be better. But it's a serious dilemma, and it's one that has economic and military implications, and it's one that will require every country to address. And the further one is, the closer one is to the Russian border, I think the more likely you're going to say, hey, if South Korea has this technology and they can deliver, we're ready to write a check right now.
Precisely. I think that's a very good point, and it speaks to the fact that Europe is divided and fragmented not only in its defense industry structure, but also in its consciousness, in its will, and its risk perception. If you're Poland, or if you're in the Baltic states, or maybe even in the Nordic region, you see a reason in arming yourself quickly and increasing your defense budget quickly. Whether that sense of urgency is shared across the continent, particularly in its southern parts and its eastern parts, its western parts rather, is perhaps more questionable. We have just a little bit of time left. I want to put one final, very precise question to all three of you. It's a big one, and I'm afraid you'll have to answer in a way that is completely unsatisfactory because it's such a big question. But NATO has just expanded this week. It took in a new member, Sweden. Is it going to take any more new members, particularly the big one, Ukraine, in the foreseeable future, despite the promises? Let me start with you, Daniel. You need to give me one sentence on this, I'm afraid.
One sentence, yes, but it will take a lot of time. I don't think within the next 10 years.
That was exactly the sort of length of answer I was looking for, and clarity. Thank you. Michael, what do you think?
I'm going to disagree with my good friend and colleague and say no, because Russia has an incentive now to keep this conflict with Ukraine a frozen conflict, because as long as Ukraine has a border dispute, its admission into NATO it vanishes towards near nothingness. And there are certain countries in Europe right now that have made that quite clear. Until this war is decided and the border is firm and secure, membership for Ukraine is off the table. So I'm going to say it's no, or it's going to be higher than those 10 years that Dan estimated.
Okay, a longish sentence, but probably still a single sentence there, Michael. Thank you. Ulla, what do you think?
I'm also more pessimistic in this regard, and it also ties to what I said before, that we are seeing a long-term war ahead of us. And I also believe that as long as the war is not over, it will be very hard to extend membership to Ukraine. But with that said, I believe that NATO will extend, or NATO countries, some kind of security guarantees to Ukraine, even though it will not get the defense guarantees.
Fantastic. Thank you. Michael Nyberg of the US Army War College, Daniel Krebs of the US Army War College, and my colleague Ulla Lovchalic of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I think this has been a terrific talk, very, very stimulating, and I have actually learned a great deal in the course of the past 75 minutes. And thank you very much to everybody for tuning in to this webinar. Please look out for future events that the Europe program at the Institute puts on. For now, thank you very much and good night.